The spotlight found him before he could walk properly. At 5 years old, Michael Jackson stood on stages that towered over him, singing with a voice that didn't belong to someone so small. His brothers moved beside him, but even then, people couldn't look away from the youngest one. His father watched from the wings with eyes that never softened, hands that never hesitated to correct mistakes. There were no lazy Saturday mornings, no bicycle rides through the neighborhood, no games of hide and seek with kids his own age. While other children learned their ABCs, Michael learned choreography. While they played with toys, he rehearsed until his little legs trembled. The Jackson 5 became America's sweethearts, but behind the matching outfits and synchronized steps lived a boy who pressed his face against windows, watching other children live the life he'd never know. He smiled for the cameras because that's what was expected, but his eyes told a different story. They held an ancient sadness, a longing that no hit record could satisfy. His childhood wasn't stolen in one dramatic moment. It slipped away gradually, like sand through fingers, replaced by rehearsals, recordings, and performances. By the time he was 10, Michael had seen more of America than most adults, yet he'd seen nothing of what it meant to simply be a kid. The screaming fans loved him, but they loved the performer, not the frightened boy beneath the sequins. At night, in hotel rooms that all looked the same, he'd lie awake wondering what normal felt like. He'd watch television shows about families and feel a strange ache in his chest. Those fictional children seemed to possess something he couldn't name, something he'd been born without. Love came with conditions in his world. Love meant perfection. Love meant never disappointing the people who depended on him. As Michael grew, so did the expectations crushing down on him. His voice changed, deepened, and briefly he wondered if his magic would disappear with his childhood pitch. But the talent only intensified, becoming something almost supernatural. He could hear a melody once and improve it. He could watch a dance move and transform it into something that defied gravity. His body became an instrument, every gesture calculated yet somehow spontaneous. Studios became his second home, or perhaps his first, since home had never really felt like sanctuary. He worked 18-hour days, driven by an inner voice more demanding than any producer. That voice whispered constantly that he wasn't good enough, that one mistake would reveal him as a fraud. So he chased perfection with a desperation that frightened those around him. The Thriller album wasn't just successful, it became a cultural earthquake. Suddenly, Michael Jackson wasn't just a performer but a phenomenon that transcended music. His moonwalk defied physics and logic, leaving audiences gasping in disbelief. Every television appearance became an event, every music video a cinematic masterpiece. But success, he discovered, was the loneliest achievement. The higher he climbed, the fewer people could reach him. Old friends fell away, unable to relate to someone who'd become larger than life. New people appeared, but their motives were always suspect. Did they love Michael, or did they love his money, his fame, his ability to open doors? Trust became impossible. Even his own reflection confused him. The face staring back from mirrors seemed to belong to a stranger, someone the world had created rather than the person he felt inside. He changed that face, again and again, searching for something he couldn't articulate. Maybe he was trying to erase the boy his father had brutalized, or perhaps he was attempting to create someone worthy of all that love and attention. The world watched his transformation with fascination and horror, making him feel more alien with each procedure. That if he couldn't reclaim his childhood, Michael decided he would build it. Neverland Ranch rose from California soil like a fever dream made real, 2,000 acres of everything a child could desire. Roller coasters pierced the sky. A railway circled the property. A zoo housed exotic animals that seemed as displaced as their owner. Movie theaters, arcade games, candy everywhere. It was Peter Pan's fantasy made tangible, a place where childhood could exist forever, frozen in amber. He invited children there, kids from hospitals and difficult circumstances, because their joy felt pure. They didn't see the megastar, they saw someone who understood that life could be hard and scary. They laughed on the rides, hugged the animals, and for those brief visits, Michael felt something approaching normalcy. Here, surrounded by innocent wonder, the constant anxiety that plagued him would quiet. But the world didn't understand. They saw something sinister in a grown man who preferred children's company, who decorated his bedroom with toys, who seemed uncomfortable around adults. The whispers started quietly, then grew into accusations that would eventually destroy everything he'd built. His intentions, pure in his mind, became twisted through the lens of a suspicious public. The irony was crushing. He'd created Neverland as a sanctuary, but it became his prison. The allegations broke something fundamental inside him. Even when accusations didn't result in convictions, the damage was permanent. Parents who'd once encouraged their children to befriend him now viewed him as dangerous. The media, which had once celebrated every moonwalk, now dissected every eccentricity as evidence of depravity. His refuge transformed into a crime scene, investigators combing through the innocent chaos looking for proof of darkness. Michael wandered the empty paths of Neverland after the trials, a ghost haunting his own dream. The ride stood silent. The animals sensed his despair. This place that was supposed to heal him had become another source of pain, another reminder that he couldn't escape the suspicion that followed him everywhere. Music had always been his salvation, the one pure thing in a complicated existence. When he danced, the world made sense. When he sang, the loneliness retreated. But gradually, even that refuge began to crumble. His later albums, brilliant though they were, couldn't recapture the universal adoration of his peak. Critics who once praised him now wrote harsh reviews. Radio stations that had fought to play his songs now skipped them in rotation. He watched younger artists dominate charts he'd once owned, and felt himself becoming a relic of the past. Financial troubles mounted despite decades of success. Bad business deals, excessive spending, and legal fees drained his fortune. Neverland, his expensive fantasy, required millions annually to maintain. He borrowed against future earnings, convinced the comeback was always just around the corner. But the comeback never quite materialized the way he imagined. The world had moved on, and Michael Jackson, once the most famous person on the planet, found himself increasingly irrelevant. Prescription medications became his companions, little pills that quieted the screaming anxiety, dulled the sharp edges of depression, and helped him sleep when his mind wouldn't stop racing. Doctors, attracted by his fame and money, prescribed whatever he requested. They called the drugs by different names, wrote prescriptions under false identities, and helped him maintain the fiction that everything was under control. His physical health deteriorated alongside his mental state. Years of demanding choreography had destroyed his body. His spine ached constantly. His skin, lightened by vitiligo and treatments, was fragile and painful. He barely ate, his frame becoming skeletal, his appearance increasingly shocking to those who remembered the vibrant performer from decades earlier. Yet through it all, he kept planning, kept dreaming. The This Is It concert series was announced as his triumphant return. 50 shows in London, a chance to prove he still possessed the magic. He threw himself into rehearsals with the obsessive dedication that had always defined him, ignoring his body's warnings that it couldn't handle the demands he placed on it. June 25, 2009. The date etched itself into history with the finality of a gravestone. Michael Jackson's heart, exhausted by decades of stress and a chemical cocktail meant to grant him rest, simply stopped beating. He died in a bedroom of a rented mansion, surrounded by prescription bottles and the desperate attempts of a doctor who'd crossed lines no physician should cross. The news spread like wildfire through a world that had forgotten how much he'd meant. Suddenly, everyone remembered. Radio stations played his music on endless loops. Television networks aired documentaries and specials. Millions who'd mocked him in life now mourned him in death, their grief perhaps tinged with guilt for the cruelty they'd shown him. The memorial service became one of the most watched events in television history, a global moment of collective sorrow. His daughter Paris spoke through tears, calling him the best father, and in that moment, the world glimpsed the private Michael, the man behind the spectacle. He'd been someone's daddy, someone who tucked his children into bed and made them feel safe, even as he himself never felt secure. The irony of his death wasn't lost on those paying attention. He'd spent his entire life chasing sleep, that basic human necessity denied to him by an overactive mind haunted by demons he couldn't name. In the end, it was that search for rest that killed him, an eternal sleep granted by a drug meant to provide temporary peace. Michael Jackson left behind a complicated legacy that defies simple categorization. His music changed the world, broke down racial barriers, and inspired generations. His humanitarian work, often overlooked, touched countless lives. Yet his personal life remained a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions, a cautionary tale about fame's cost and childhood's importance. Perhaps his greatest achievement was teaching the world about loneliness at the top, showing that all the love screamed from audiences couldn't fill the void created by a childhood spent performing instead of living. He spoke love through his music, but couldn't find it for himself. His shadow was loneliness, and it followed him to the very end.